Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player.
My guest today is Valerie Stimac. She is the founder of the recently created spacetourismguide.com. Hi, Valerie.
Hi.
So I actually know you because you were also a travel blogger, and even though we haven't met in real life, we've talked online probably for like a year.
At least, yeah.
This is like the Space Tourism Guide is your new project. What you founded it? When did you found it? Last year?
The first post went live in early 2017.
Okay, cool. And what made you decide to go into space tourism as your job?
Yeah, so as you said, I was a travel blogger and I was trying to kind of find my footing or find my niche in that space. And I apologize in advance for any inadvertent space puns that I make. It just kind of happens. I really found that I had a passion for space in a way that I hadn't realized in years past. I mean, I think a lot of kids, especially in America, grow up and they want to be an astronaut, and then they kind of realize what the requirements are and what you have to do to become an astronaut, and the dream sort of dies for most people quite young. But I was looking at, what are the opportunities in space or in travel and in travel media to make a difference and have a unique voice. And what I came to realize is that we were sort of sitting on the cusp of the last frontier, which is space. And there's a lot of analogies that's been said by much more brilliant writers than me, that space is this frontier for people to explore. But while we've been exploring it for almost 80 years, most civilians haven't been going. So there's been space exploration, but there hasn't been commercial space exploration or having civilians or normal people going to space. And we're really close to that right now. So I took the time and looked at the industry and looked at what people who were looking at travel were saying, and a lot of people were really dismissing it, saying, it's never going to happen. It's never going to be cost affordable. I said that I don't think that's true. I mean, Antarctica wasn't affordable for most people 50 years ago. It is now. This is going to happen. Can I be early enough to really make a difference and help people get the resources they need? And from that, Space Tourism Guide was born.
Well, I have a feeling that anyone listening to this podcast, or probably the majority of people listening to this, you're already doing them a service, because I don't think that they realize that this was a trip that they may potentially be able to take in their lifetime. So that's super cool. And when I think of space tourism, and when you and I have talked about it, I have been thinking about, because obviously this is a history show and I'm a history travel writer, all of the amazing locations in the world that have to do with space. And that made me realize that actually one of my earliest travel memories was going to the Houston Space Center. I think I was 8. We were on a road trip, and I sat in a space chair, and they spin you around, and you eat ice cream that's in those little pebble things, and it was just an amazing trip. And I realized there's all this space history that I haven't thought about since I was little either, and so that's why I'm really excited to talk to you about the history. And it's so cool to connect what has happened in the past with the potential of where people can go. Not only can people go to Houston now, that they actually could maybe have these types of experiences themselves in the future. That's super cool.
Yeah. So right now the website focuses basically just on Earth-based space tourism. And that would be going to Houston, going to watch a rocket launch, going stargazing, because that's what's accessible for people now. And there is no website that really provides all those resources in one place. In the long term, I'd love to have additional resources on, what's it like going up in a balloon to low Earth orbit? What is it like taking a rocket ride to low Earth orbit? How can you compare the costs? And what are the services that help you manage the finances of doing these trips? But that's a couple years down the road, at least.
I don't think that I realized that that's where we were, as a species, you know what I mean? I'm sure you have conversations all the time where people are surprised that this is happening or will happen.
Yeah, it's now increasingly good surprise, because a lot of what I saw even 18 months ago, 2 years ago, was negative surprise. Not oh wow, that's going to happen, but more people basically saying it's never going to happen. Like, yeah, I see that these billionaires are spending all their money developing this technology, but it's not going to happen. Like, thanks for telling me that these guys are wasting their money trying to send people to space.
So let's talk about some of the earliest space history that we have. And I don't think Houston is a fancy destination that people think of for like travel when they think of like, I want to really get away or I want to go to a really historic place. But the Houston Space Center is an amazing place to visit, and so many important things in space history actually happened there or happened because of work that was there. So, how did Houston even become this center for NASA? And tell us what exactly is there.
Sure. I'll try and make this history of NASA as concise as possible. And what I found in learning more about NASA is that while we think it takes a long time, that we don't really think the government moves very quickly. And it's important to remember that NASA is a government organization. The development of Johnson Space Center, what became Johnson Space Center in Houston, and then Houston Space Center Houston, happened very quickly. President Kennedy in the late 1950s, early 1960s, he really put the pedal to the metal on getting a space program going. I mean, we had NASA from 1958 onward, but within 3 to 4 years, we had a massive development across the country of NASA facilities and NASA research, and the increase in the number of astronauts being trained. And a lot of that is all tied to Houston. So, brief history of NASA. There is technology development that dates back into the early part of the 20th century. Basically, as soon as we had the ability to fly, the government was looking at different ways to use flight technology and aerospace to build various tools of government, which is mostly to say defense or war technology. Yeah. In 1957, 1958, most people know that the Russians were successful in launching the first satellite, Sputnik, and that really ignited the public interest in the U.S. in, investing as a country in aerospace technology. So officially NASA's birthday is July 29th, 1958. So this year will actually be their 60th birthday, NASA's 60th birthday.
Oh, that's so cool. Are they having parties?
I haven't seen anything publicized about any sort of celebrations at NASA facilities or any. It's kind of interesting that they're not really talking about it yet. You'd think that they would be.
Yeah, well, NASA, you got to let us know if there's a cool party we can go to.
I will. My guess is that they'll probably try and do things nationwide at NASA facilities across the country, because there are a lot more facilities than people realize. And it's not like you have to travel, all the way to the East Coast or something. So yeah, NASA was born almost 60 years ago, and it absorbed its predecessor. There's an agency called NACA. It absorbed that. It absorbed a $100 million budget, which at the time was not a small amount, 2 test facilities and 3 research facilities. So when NASA was born, it already had a little bit of a foundation. The facilities that comprised NASA were Langley in Virginia, Ames in Northern California, which is actually right down the bay from me, and then Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory in Ohio, which is what is now called Glenn Research Center.
Okay.
So most people know Langley. That's sort of was the rising star of NASA early on, because that was mission control and where the projects Mercury and Gemini were based. And if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, this is where that movie took place, was at Langley in Virginia.
Okay. And is it also like CIA or something? I feel like I've heard of that in like Homeland.
Yeah. So Langley, Virginia, as like a city, that's also where the CIA headquarters are located. So Langley, gotcha. It's just south of Washington, D.C. And there was a lot of government development. If you know anything about the Eastern Seaboard, there's a lot of government facilities all up and down around in the D.C., Virginia, Maryland area.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah. So that's 1958. By 1961, President Kennedy has said we're going to the moon. And that really kicks NASA into high gear, as I said. And it became very apparent that Langley, as a NASA facility, which reported to what had been created Goddard Flight Center. Goddard is another major facility that you can go visit. It just wasn't big enough to handle the type of development and training that NASA was going to need to put men on the moon. So in 1961, the government authorized the search for either a new facility or to build a new facility for manned spaceflight and the testing of all the technology and training, everything that was going to be needed to do that. That's where NASA stood at the time that what would eventually become Houston Space Center and Johnson Space Center were born.
That's amazing. So that's where NASA is up until the point where Houston gets selected. I'm still curious because Houston is you mentioned a lot of East Coast stuff. Houston just seems so out of left field. How did Houston get selected?
Sure. Yeah. So it's really interesting that Houston wasn't immediately the choice that was made by NASA. In fact, there was another city and another facility that they thought they would take over instead. So 1961, the NASA administrator is James Webb, which for any space fans who are listening, they will recognize that name because currently there's a giant space telescope that's being developed and built and will be launched in probably 2020, and it's named after James Webb.
Oh,
so
cool.
James Webb is the NASA administrator. He tasks a man named Robert Gilruth with finding the location for the next NASA center. He made a long list of requirements, including that it had to have a moderate climate, it had to be near water transport and air transport, it had to be large enough. It had all these requirements that were sort of like infrastructure based, but it also had to be near a culturally active community in the vicinity of a university or an institution of higher education. This was something that they kind of knew they needed to funnel, and they needed it to be a place where people would want to live. You know, a lot of things we hear about now, NASA's working out in the desert or something, and like people don't live out there, right? Like it's not a pleasant place to live. They go out there for work and then they move into the community. So this is the checklist. And some of the cities that made the list initially were places like Jacksonville, Tampa, Baton Rouge, Corpus Christi, so another Texas city, San Diego, and San Francisco. Yeah. So it's kind of this band across this part of the U.S. gets marked as like these cities meet all or most of these requirements. And Houston was also on that list. As is the case in government selection, or when any big corporation wants to select a new sort of headquarters or development facility, there was a lot of courting, like a lot of other cities like, come visit our city and see how great we are. It was sort of like when Amazon recently announced that they were looking for a new headquarters city, and every city was like, we pick us. So there were a lot of
exactly what was running through my head was you were talking about this process.
Yeah. So other cities like Norfolk, Virginia, Boston also threw their names in the ring. Initially, Tampa was the top choice because the Air Force was supposed to vacate. They were closing down one of their major operations in Tampa, and they were going to be leaving this area available that NASA could kind of like move in and take over, and that would be the new space center. But the Air Force decided not to do that. And so the second choice on the list was Houston. And that's why Houston was chosen, because Tampa wasn't available and Houston met all the other requirements that they were looking for. And so that's where they went.
Wow. It's one of those interesting counterfactuals. Like, what would Florida be like if Tampa had gotten it? Although it's not like they are missing space places.
Yeah. Actually, when I looked at it, I'm glad it's not Tampa, not because I don't think Tampa would have deserved that development, but because putting all of your space eggs in one basket is a strategic risk. There was a recent video that was circulated by, Vladimir Putin showing off Russia's new ballistic missiles, and he pointed them at Florida. That. Putting all of our space tech and all of our development and all of the people who make these decisions in one state is a risk, and I'm almost glad it didn't work out that way, because it diversifies across the country where the important centers for aerospace are located.
Well, that's so interesting, because I think a lot of, like, when I think of space exploration, I think of like historically important moments and like patriotism, but this is all science. This is all information. Like, they're looking for information that will go into like national security. And it's interesting to think about like exactly how wide the actual NASA mission is compared to like how I interact with NASA.
Exactly. NASA's done a really good job in the last 10 years of, I would say it's a really strong PR campaign of really trying to re-engage the American public in the pride in our space program and the patriotism of being a fan of space. Like, they're doing a really nice job of that. But at the end of the day, they're a government organization. A lot of the technology they develop is for the government that then gets passed down to consumers. So, they do have to make these kind of like logistical and defense and strategic decisions when they develop new facilities. So
now that once it gets selected, what's the process like to get up and running, and what kinds of work are they doing there?
Yeah, so one of the requirements for the facility that would be built or would be taken over is to have 1,000 acres of land. So the first thing that they had to do was acquire the land in Houston. They worked with several contractors and sort of just built out this giant complex, almost like a university campus, is a good kind of a good way to think of it. When you look at the aerial footage, it really looks like a university campus with a bunch of different buildings. And the main objective of what is at the time called the Manned Spaceflight Laboratory is to train astronauts to go to space. That's it. And so the primary thing that it sounds sort of reductionist, but the primary things that happen at Johnson Space Center historically and still are astronaut training and mission control. And mission control meaning everything that helps astronauts successfully complete missions in space.
So that is a great segue, because when I think of Houston, aside from thinking of myself as an 8-year-old on like a super cool trip, I think of the movie Apollo 13 and like that mission control room. And when you're there and you tour it, like you get to see it. I believe that they have like, I don't remember if they have an exact replica or if it's still the room, but you get to see kind of what it was like to be there during the like heyday of the space age. But what are some important historic events from the age of space exploration that actually were taking place in Houston?
Sure. So it's interesting when you look at the history of NASA in that Houston and mission control, if they're doing their job well, you don't really hear about them, right? Like it's a bunch of really intelligent people helping a space flight go well. And as long as it goes well, they kind of disappear quietly into history. So mission control the mission control in Houston is officially responsible for every manned vehicle and the astronauts aboard that vehicle from the time that the rocket or spacecraft clear the launch tower. So the launch tower and like whatever happens on the launch pad are the responsibility of the launching facility, and then mission control takes over as soon as they get clear of that until that craft comes back to Earth. So mission control is involved in every aspect of what's happening for astronauts when they're up in space and on the way to space and on the way back down.
So they're kind of the brain of each individual space mission, and the body is out there in the actual rocket or whatever doing the work.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So for most people who know space history, we don't launch from the U.S. anymore. That's one of the big developments that's going to come, I think, before we see widespread commercial spaceflight for civilians is SpaceX and other players in the industry seem to be lining up to try and take manned launches back onto U.S. soil. Right now, everything is launched through Russia. And as I sort of indicated earlier, that's a tenuous relationship at best.
It seems like the last year and a half has proved that our Russia relationship is tense and interesting.
Yeah.
And scary.
Yeah. And it's important that, I think that people forget that when we talk about Russia, at any point in time, right now, even as we're recording, as you're listening, dear listener, there are Americans in space aboard the International Space Station, and they were put there on a Russian rocket. And that means we kind of have to work it out with Russia, because that's how we put more people up there. That's how we bring people home. We've gotten to the point where we're doing our resupply missions. SpaceX has been doing a lot of them, and there's actually another launch in roughly mid-April. So I don't know if that'll be before or after this episode airs, but SpaceX has been doing resupply missions, which is good. It means we can get supplies up to our astronauts. But, it's much more important to keep some sort of civility with Russia than people realize in terms of aerospace and what our astronauts are doing. Mission Control directs all of our American astronauts on the International Space Station. So anything that our astronauts are doing, they're talking with Houston about what they're doing, what data they're getting, et cetera.
So what are some important moments in Houston's history when it comes to the missions to land on the moon?
Sure. Yeah. So Johnson Space Center, I'm going to call it Johnson, even though it hasn't always been called Johnson Space Center. Johnson Space Center is where everything from the Apollo missions onward, all of the mission control happened at Johnson. So when you watch a movie or you look at old documentary footage of moon landings or anything related to the moon landings and those missions, and they're talking to Houston, they're talking to Johnson Space Center. I think growing up, I didn't quite get that was like, oh, I'm talking to the city, like the city of Houston, or like, I maybe thought it was a code name or it was like a person's name. Or it was the name of the person's role. No, Houston, when they're calling Houston, they're talking to mission control. That's the name that the astronauts will use. So the famous kind of short truncated quote would be, Houston, the Eagle has landed. That would be Apollo 11, the moon landing. They're talking to the mission control facility and all of the people working there in Houston, Texas. The same goes for Apollo 13, which most people would recognize that story from the movie. Houston, we've had a problem. They're calling mission control and saying something's gone wrong in space. And mission control jumps into action trying to help them troubleshoot and solve the errors that happen in space.
So when that happens, so like you were saying earlier, when things are going well, Houston's just in the background and they're the brain, but the public doesn't need to know like what is actually happening. But when things went wrong, what actually happened at Houston that allowed them to be helpful to the mission that was floating in space? I mean, Tom Hanks was literally just out there.
Yeah. So Johnson Space Center isn't just a single room, which is mission control. And I've actually been in that historic mission control room and the new one. That's just one room of a complex of, a couple dozen buildings. So when something goes wrong, they have access to all of the equipment that the astronauts have been trained on. So there's all kinds of flight simulators and spacecraft, and everything that the astronauts are potentially going to encounter in space is simulated at Johnson Space Center. So they can, from mission control, they can reach out to scientists and engineers in Johnson and say, hey, we've got this problem. We need you to solve it here on Earth so we can tell the guys in space how to solve it. Or the guys and ladies. Now we have women astronauts. That's been happening for several decades. But at the time of the Apollo missions, it was all men in space. So the nice thing is that, it's not just some people sitting behind screens and talking through kind of complex computations. They can actually go physically solve problems and come up with those solutions, bring them back to the astronauts and communicate to help them solve whatever's happening up in space.
So while the Apollo 13 is having its issues, so they've said, Houston, we have a problem, and Houston is researching the problem in this giant complex. What actually was the problem that Apollo 13 was having, and what was the actual solution, and how did that get worked out?
Forgive me if my memory is not 100% accurate here. If my memory serves, the issue that Apollo 13 encountered is that an oxygen tank exploded on their way to the moon. And so obviously oxygen is in very high demand in space. It's not there. We need to bring it with us if we want to keep breathing. And so what the team down at Johnson Space Center did is they basically had to solve how to help the astronauts stay alive with less of a resource that they needed. So if I remember correctly, it was they had to help them develop an air filtration system and rework the ventilation system on their module to help it serve as a lifeboat until they could come back to Earth. And so they have to look at all of the physical pieces of technology and hardware that are on any given module and use those to assemble a new technical solution to, the air ventilation system. It might help if I draw an analogy for those who aren't familiar. If you've seen the movie The Martian, that does, I think, a nice job of honoring what happens on Earth when something goes wrong in space, in that you see a lot of the engineers on Earth using the exact same technology or simulators or replicas to try and solve the problem that an astronaut has encountered when they're not on Earth. So, we can see that this astronaut only has this type of wrench and this type of plastic tubing and this type of tape. We need to figure out how to make that airtight. Let's do it on Earth, and then we can communicate that to an astronaut, and then they can replicate that with what they only had so much up there. Here's what they can do with that technology that they have.
That's amazing. Is there any other event or anything else historically you want to touch on about this time period?
Sure. So I'd say Houston in general, because it's where astronauts are trained and where mission control is based, it has, unfortunately, most of the times that Houston gains any sense of being historically important is when something goes wrong. And so after both the Challenger and Columbia space shuttle accidents, Presidents Reagan and Bush spoke at memorial services at Johnson Space Center. It's the kind of thing where that's the community that these astronauts would have been from. Their families would have been there. They would have been trained there. And so the historical notes on Houston as a facility that has something important happening is unfortunately often when something doesn't go right. And that's a good thing for them too, because when they do their jobs well, there's no need to make a historical footnote about it.
That's interesting too, because I I associate the Challenger mission with Florida because that's literally where it happened. But if you don't know what was happening at Houston in terms of the community of astronauts learning how to be astronauts together and everything being centered there personnel wise, it makes complete sense now to me why like the presidential visit and the main center of mourning would be in Texas. But I guess you have to know what the different pieces are to know why that's kind of a heart of NASA. So that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's the whole process of learning about what Houston does is very much, you don't have a good sense until you try and really look closely. And then you suddenly see that, like you said, it's sort of the heart and the brain of NASA, and all of the other NASA facilities and all of our work in space it's using what's happening in Houston, especially when it's related to astronauts. It all extends out from Houston.
Well, and I think there's like a huge America in decline theme about like, oh, now we don't even do our launches from America. I remember hearing that in the news or being complained about by somebody in the news whenever that decision was made. But if you think of like, well, most of the important things in history actually happened in Houston, and Houston is still there and just as strong as ever. Like, it makes that decision seem much less like damning to the not damning necessarily, but it makes it seem less impactful. And we need to get facilities back if we want to make some of these things cost effective in the future, but it's not the same thing as having no space program.
Absolutely. Yeah. Houston is just crucial to the space program. There are other facilities. Every facility contributes its own part. But when you think about the public facing part of NASA, Houston is one of those real cores of where you can interact with the U.S. space program.
Which that's actually so interesting because, I mentioned a couple times, like it's one of my like early memories of travel was to travel there, but it's not necessarily a given that like an important place of scientific inquiry, research, and like mission control will also be a tourist spot with gift shops and displays and models and games. Like, how did it become a center for tourism?
Yeah, so I think most of the major NASA facilities have some sort of visitor center because as government facilities, I think they understand they're kind of accountable to the people and that people are interested in space and they want to come interact with it. So Houston, there was originally a visitor center housed in a building called Building 2, very stimulating name, on Johnson Space Center's grounds. That was the public affairs office. It was the media briefing room. That was the visitor center until 1992. And then in 1994, Space Center Houston opened up next door, actually off of the Johnson Space Center grounds. So it's public land that you can easily go in and out of, but with access to Johnson. And that's become the real visitor center and tourism destination for Johnson. They facilitate tours onto Johnson to different buildings. It's a Smithsonian affiliated museum, and it's stunning. I mean, if you went to Space Center Houston, you walk into this enormous atrium that's dimly lit, and every space artifact you could ever want to encounter seems to be in that one building.
Yeah, it's not just, so I feel like they have experiential things that you can do and things where you can learn, but then you can also see the memorabilia because we now have, 60 years of history of this part of our country. So it's a really cool place to visit. What if somebody was going to go there? What are some things you would say that they definitely need to make sure to see?
Yeah, so the one that I think you kind of hinted at it's called the Starship Gallery. So once you enter the atrium at Space Center Houston, there's this gallery wing off to the side, and in it you sort of walk through the history of NASA, including the Mercury program, Gemini, Apollo. They have a piece of the Skylab. I believe it's a simulation of Skylab. They have lunar artifacts in that gallery. And then it kind of ends with you walking out into what's called Independence Plaza, where you can walk aboard the Space Shuttle Independence, which when it was in operation was called the Explorer. And so you can go into a space shuttle and see what the facility is like on a space shuttle. You can walk through the huge carrier jet that used to carry the space shuttle around. And it's sort of like you can step through the entire U.S. Space flight program in this gallery. absolutely must do. I'd also highly recommend taking the tour of Johnson Space Center. And there's actually a VIP option that is a substantially larger amount of money to do, but it's worth it because you get to go into some buildings that people who take the regular tour don't get to go into. So, I think the basic tram tour of Johnson is included in your ticket for Space Center Houston, but the VIP option, if you are a really big space fan or you have a child who is, it's going to be an unforgettable and worthwhile upgrade to the VIP tour.
And this is a place where families, like, I don't have children. I don't always think of like, what's a family friendly trip? Like, I went to Auschwitz and we're doing an episode about Auschwitz, and I don't know how you decide if you take your kid to Auschwitz or not, but Johnson Space Center is so much fun if you're a kid, and it's super cool if you're an adult too. So it's a perfect place if you do need to have a family friendly vacation.
Absolutely. Yeah. It has everything for anyone who's interested in space and science and what the U.S. is doing. It's a great place to go.
Now, normally I don't always ask this question, but because of what you do, you have some interesting information about other things. What are some other places people should go if they're interested in space history, but maybe they can't get to Houston?
Yeah. So the big one, of course, is going to be Kennedy Space Center. That's located in Florida. I think that is far more visited than Houston. So if you're looking to get the traditional experience, you go to Kennedy. If you want to get kind of off the beaten path as a traveler, you could go to Houston. I know Goddard Space Center in Maryland does tours. Increasingly, there's a lot of reports coming out of, if you want to see a space flight, that Florida's really become an actual destination to go watch rocket launches again, which is exciting.
Oh, because
it used to be that way. Yeah, there's just a lot. Right. There's a lot more launches happening than there have been in the past decade. And so there's a lot of opportunity to see launches. Other facilities are slightly more difficult to visit. Like I'm thinking about JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratories in Southern California. I believe you can do tours. It's not as easy to go visit. There are also, this is one thing that I've been sort of building out very slowly, is there are air and space museums all across the country. I mean, almost every major city in the U.S. has an air and space museum that's going to have space artifacts. It's going to have either replicas or actual spacecraft, and those are really accessible for families who are doing even just local travel to be able to go and interact with space history.
So, yeah, because what I'm thinking is like, this is one of the few areas where science history is super interesting in a museum format. Like, because I do so much history travel, sometimes I find myself in like history of science museums, or today I was writing about like a mineralogical museum because it covers like the history, and it's just like, it's not as accessible, especially not to small kids, if you don't know the science. But space history, if you love history and you want to learn a little bit more about science, is really accessible because it's such a big picture idea, and we've been exposed to it for, if you're under 60 or your whole life. So it's whereas some of the other science type museums I just think are not as flashy.
Yeah. It's interesting with space and space history is I go talk through all this. We really don't talk through how complicated and hard it is to send people to space. We got to give them a lot of credit at NASA because they did this. Hidden Figures really demonstrates this. They did this without computers. They figured out all the math of sending people to space in a way we can't really even conceive of. We just sort of know it happens, and it's a given for almost everyone who's alive now. But it was not an easy process, even though it happened rapidly and was very quickly aided by computers and technology. It's really interesting. And the museums do a nice job of kind of giving that high level view and then letting you sort of dive into the science without really getting into like the deep physics or engineering that actually makes spaceflight possible. Sure. So the easiest place is on our website, spacetourismguide.com. And then we have a Facebook page, a Twitter account, and an Instagram. They are all called Space Tourism Guide. So it should, there's not a lot of competition still. I still think there's so much opportunity for people, especially if you come from a tourism perspective or you're interested in traveling on Earth to encounter space and space history. There's not a lot of competition, so it's pretty easy to find me.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And if I end up going to somewhere, like, I haven't been to Kennedy, but if I ever end up going to Kennedy, you'll have to come back and tell us about the history of Kennedy.
Sure, happy to do so.